this is Grandmaster Bryan Smith, and you are watching a DVD courtesy of The Chess World. The subject of this DVD will be the strength of the knight in the middle game. We're going to be seeing examples where knights show incredible activity or great control of the position. So these will fall into basically two categories. We're going to see examples of a long-term advantage of a stronger knight over an inferior bishop. And we'll also see some examples where the knights show explosive activity in attacking. To begin with, we're going to see a very positional example from a famous game, Mattissons versus Nimzowitsch. This will introduce our topic, where we're going to see the positional features which make Black's knight superior to the bishop. Let's get started. This game took place in Carlsbad, 1929. Nimzowitsch had the black pieces, and he played his own defense, which was subsequently named after him, the Nimzowitsch defense. Nimzo-Indian, rather, defense. So, White played the simple response knight f3. Of course, still a move that's played nowadays, although the alternatives e3 and queen c2 are more commonly seen. Nevertheless, knight f3 has its points. And here, Nimzowitsch played a slightly unusual move, a kind of move that he favored, but which didn't end up being basically accepted by theory as time went by. He took on c3 immediately without any provocation. Normally Black will wait until White plays a3 to capture on c3. But Nimzowitsch had no qualms about giving up the knight for the bishop. Giving up the bishop for the knight, that is. Creating doubled pawns in White's position. And then he continued with d6. So he now arranges some pawns on the dark squares to compensate for the missing bishop. White played queen to c2, aiming for e4, which is a reasonable move, although bishop g5 was also worth considering. But queen c2, okay, he played queen c2. Queen e7. And now the next move White played, bishop a3, was not the best. The bishop turns out to be not well placed on a3, and in fact later even becomes a bit of a problem for White. But in any case, it doesn't turn out to have any activity or any role on a3. White is looking at perhaps playing c5, but Black can easily stop this. And not only that, the move c5 is not necessarily even that effective in some cases, in most cases. Instead of bishop a3, White could have played bishop g5, pinning the knight. One of the reasons Black probably delayed castling is that he most likely wanted to drive the bishop with g5 and perhaps here even follow up with knight h5, which with Black castled wouldn't be quite as good. There's other ways Black can play. He might have also driven the bishop, let's say, and then continued just developing with b6, keeping g5 as an option. But it can be beneficial in these positions to delay castling. White could have also continued with the intention behind queen c2, presumably of playing e4. I think he wanted, with bishop a3, to threaten e4, because here Black's intended response was e5. This was the purpose of queen e7. And with bishop on a3, this wouldn't be possible, but well, bishop a3 was in that case somewhat naive that Black would miss the threat. So here's how Black would have responded if White had played e4 immediately. Now the threat is to take on d4 and capture on e4, so White would play bishop d3. And then there are a number of ways Black could play, maybe c5, or he could also try to induce the move d5 without playing c5. And the game will be a typical kind of Nimzo-Indian, with White having doubled pawns but two bishops and a large center. Instead, bishop a3. So as we saw, if Black just ignores this and castles, well, this would have fallen into a trap, because then White would get e4 in, and e5 would not be possible for Black, so then it would lead to some problems for Black. White might even play e5 himself very soon, driving the knight from f6, and increasing the pressure on the b1 to h7 diagonal after bishop d3 follows, and gaining play on the dark squares rather than having black able to blockade the dark squares with his own pawn. So, however, Nimzowitsch was not going to overlook White's threat and played c5 himself. So essentially bishop a3 was kind of a trap, but a harmful trap from White's perspective, because now the bishop is poorly placed. Here White made a further inaccuracy, playing g3. He wants to develop his bishop to g2, but we'll see why this turns out badly, because first of all, the c4 square is further weakened. So black is able to create threats against c4 more quickly. But another problem is that black will simply meet White's fianchetto with his own fianchetto, which leads to the high likelihood of the light squared bishops being exchanged, which benefits black because it leaves black with a strong knight against White's bad bishop on a3, or ineffectual bishop, especially with the fact that it can't cover c4. And it relieves White of his two bishops. So rather than g3, it was better to play some other move like e3 or perhaps e4. White played g3, b6. The best answer. While black still has the chance, he neutralizes White's bishop, which will go to g2, and develops his own bishop to the long diagonal. Both sides castled, and now knight h4. This also was a mistake. So White makes small mistakes, no real tactical mistakes, subtle mistakes, but very quickly his game becomes hopeless positionally. Here the bishops are traded, which helps black, and additionally the knight goes to the side of the board on h4, where it's poorly placed and loses time. Rather than playing knight h4, White should have played some move like maybe rook e1 or something, trying to play e4. But black has a good game in any case here. Very, very nice advantage already. Knight h4, however, clarifies things in black's favor. White took with the king now. Taking with the knight was probably a little bit better, but it's not a very big difference. Queen b7. This begins a very nice maneuver. Black already creates concrete problems for White due to his poorly placed bishop and weak pawn on c4. So with tempo, the queen goes over. King g1, queen a6. White's pieces are forced into awkward positions. The bishop's under attack on a3, and the pawn on c4 is under attack. There's only one good reply to defend both. Queen b3. Now black still hasn't completed his development, but he's about to, and White's position is already extremely difficult. Knight c6. The knight comes in, and it aims ultimately at c4. So right now the plan is to play knight a5. It also is black's also threatening, at least eventually, to take on d4. So seeing as White had a reply to knight a5 that didn't lose material, White decided to play rook f to d1, protecting d4. However, although black is not going to win the pawn on c4, he's going to end up with a dominating knight on that same square. It's often the case that when there are weak doubled pawns, that even when the weak pawn disappears, is traded off, the square remains weak and can even be more of a problem than the weak pawn it was to begin with. Knight a5. So black plays knight a5 anyway. Queen b5 is the only reply. This is what White was relying on. But he ends up in a positionally hopeless position anyway. Black took on b5. So he can't win the pawn because his own queen is hanging, but he took on b5, pawn takes, and now knight c4. Here we start to see the strength of the knight compared to White's bishop. You can't really say that White's bishop is blocked in somehow after it goes to c1. In fact, it has a very long diagonal. But this bishop is simply ineffective compared to the black knights. The black knight on c4 and also later the knight on f6. The bishop has no targets, and the knight, meanwhile, on c4 is on a very strong and invulnerable square there are further weaknesses in white's position that allow black to use the knights to create quick threats, c3 in particular, and also the b5 pawn, as we'll see in a moment. So here, it might be natural to play knight d5, and in fact that move is probably not so bad, but it was more important here to activate the other pieces, especially the rooks. In order to use black's strong knight and his positional advantage of this good outpost square on c4, other pieces need to be involved. And so it was best here, while it's still impossible for white to play a4 in response, to play a6. This forces white to open the a file and creates a new weakness on a2, which can barely be defended. Really can't be defended, in fact. So without white making any tactical mistakes after capturing on a6, okay, he has to, because otherwise a4 is not possible because of the pin, and rook b1 would just allow black to take on b5 and then take on a2. So white took and rook takes, and now without white really having made any tactical mistakes, just positional mistakes, black already has a winning position and white is already losing material. Ultimately, he won't be able to defend the pawn on a2, and black's only task is to make sure that his position is absolutely won before he makes any changes in it. So here white took on c5, looking for some kind of play. Opens the d file. Otherwise, black was just going to play rook f to a8, probably knight to d5 at some moment, and white's pawns were going to just fall. So white took on c5, black took back with the b pawn. To move his pawns closer to the center. White's passed a pawn is not very important. Knight to g2, and here black could already play rook to a8, but rather than immediately plucking the fruit, he decided to attack an even more relevant knight c3. The knight comes in now, the pawn on c3. The knight now comes into d5 with tempo, and it's even stronger for black to win the pawn on c3, because then the pawn on a2 will fall as well. Meanwhile, the knights jump in and create tactical threats to win even more than just a pawn or two. So here white defended c3, really the only way he could. Rook to d3, bishop d2 wouldn't have helped. Black could just, for instance, play rook to a8 as well here, and and then the bishop will be under attack in a moment. So this was not helping white either. So he played rook to d3, defending the pawn on c3. Rook f to a8. Black attacks the pawn on a2. He prepares to simply capture that pawn, and then the bishop still on c1 will be a further problem for white. There will be a threat to pin and win the bishop by rook to a1. So with the desperation, white played e4, but now came black's intended reply to this, knight e5. And here white resigned, since the rook is under attack. Taking the knight will lose the exchange, leaving black with a one game. The rook moves, black will take on c3, also on a2. The a pawn will fall as well, and that's just the beginning, because white's whole position will collapse. The e4 pawn will also be under attack, and black's knights will jump in. So white resigned here with plenty of justification. So we see how these knights, especially the knight that went to c4 and now went to e5, jumped all over white's position, and it was really not much tactics in this game. This last move, knight e5, was really the only move that you could even basically call tactical in any way. That's not very much, but this was nevertheless a 23-move miniature, purely by positional methods, illustrating the strength of the knight in the middle game.